Throughout the creation of my major work, I've recorded and developed a large array of assets to utilize. This goes from Foley, to special effects, to footage, and even animations, each having their own design process, problems, and prototypes that impact my major work. Using a fractal noise base layer, I manipulated the size, spread, and offset turbulence, followed by a reduced opacity mask to create a realistic smoke effect. Special effects such as my solar flare and portal effect use similar fractal noise base layers as a starting point for further development. Firstly, my solar flare with a base fractal noise effect, used in collaboration with an inverted mask, netting, as well as VC color vibrance, allows me to create a randomized fire mask to be used in collaboration with my 3D sun. This will add depth, texture, and realism. Also, my portal effect with a base fractal noise, in conjunction with RC Trapco particular, allows for me to manipulate a great range of features to create an opening and closing portal sequence. Adding to my intro, I developed a basic text vector logo in Adobe Illustrator. This allowed for me to animate multiple coloured electric saber masks around the border of the text. Overall, I am not happy with this initial prototype, as I feel like it came out very two-dimensional and cartoon-like. I made a 3D environment by creating a range of solid clouds, by applying a turbulent displacement effect on a reduced opacity solid object. This is the same process within this scene, adding additional light rays to the top of the scene. I then created lightning underneath the cloud layer using a directional lightning effect after animating the fork spikes and the path of the lightning bolts. Additionally, I ended up adding a granite texture to my Illustrator asset, enhancing it with the CC glass effect on the alpha channel to make it burst through the layer. I'm overall happy with my final intro, as I feel like it's more realistic and detailed than my initial prototype, as I intended to create it. From here, I proceeded to create a range of different sized polyspheres and space them relatively to scale across the workspace using the movement tool and the X and Y axes. Next, adding NASA images to planet objects with blend textures to reflect future lighting from the sunlight source, then using Lambert non-reflective textures for the sun. To create a movement sequence, I needed to group each individual object to the sun, then rotate the sun to create an animation path. For lighting, I initially used a directional light from inside the sun and positioned the directional light beams away from the center of the scene. This enabled lighting on the inside of the planets but did not illuminate the sun. Through additional research, I was able to reveal that I needed to create a base surface shader with the texture of the sun in order to be illuminated when rendered. Finally, I animated the path of the camera to ensure that renditions were complete within the frame to create a picture sequence that looked visually pleasing and cinematic when rendered. Throughout my testing of 16, 24, and 60 frames per second, I identified that 24 frames per second would be the perfect frame rate, as it allows for smooth animation movements, rather than too fast or too choppy, faster rendition times, and smaller file sizes due to less images having to be stored on the hard drive. Even with the strength of my desktop computer, as I built it for CPU and GPU intensive programs, I still encountered technical issues while navigating large files, as well as trying to render detailed scenes in full quality. I fixed this by dedicating larger amounts of RAM to running programs to help support my processor and graphics card. I further proceeded to create a more detailed low poly space station using Arnold AI lighting and textures. This is in order to create a higher quality futuristic scene when rendered. This is a much more difficult and labour intensive animation process, as rendering times are high and large amounts of trial and error are needed in order to create a detailed scene. When developing my first prototype, I started by applying a tint layer with a linear wipe and a shadow effect. When I was animating the properties within the effect, I felt like they were of low quality and didn't really reflect the dusty and pixelated effect I was going for. I was not happy with this initial effect, so I took a different approach. I developed my own green screen asset by combining the rotoscoping effect with a green solid background layer. From here, I animated the mask path of the dust and the opacity in order to animate the dust to rise along the time sequence. A new solid emitter layer with Trapco particle was developed, then expanding the particle settings in order to create a dusty smoke effect expanding from the actor into the screen. From here, item physics and gravity were applied to the dust formation in order to give it some structure integrity as well as pulling it into the screen. After seeing the final result of this effect, I'm extremely happy with the outcome, as I feel like it's a lot more realistic and detailed than the first prototype that I created. Recording while using cardio patterns on the Blue Yeti in conjunction with the pop filter allows for optimal audio recording and detection. Water effects created, as well as boat sounds, enhance the overall atmosphere of the scene. Frame by frame animation was conducted at 24 frames per second to produce a fluid animation across the timeline. Each frame was drawn with a slight altercation to the previous one in order to convey the illusion of motion. Although this process was very time consuming, I am quite happy with the outcome. Adjustments were made to counteract static noise by adjusting audio frequencies.
Guys, we need a new production. Our last one was a complete failure. Guys, we need a new production. Our last one was a complete failure.
Production within Photoshop allowed for a range of modifications to be made. Photo editing of key movements and positioning within the scene allowed for a combination of filters, tints, brushes and art styles in order to create artwork to use alongside my footage. Before I could start animating, I first started off by going into Autodesk Maya and modelling the shape of a UFO. I then imported the UFO into Adobe After Effects, textured it, and placed it into the composition. Through testing and repetitively replaying the animation sequence, I was able to identify the UFO did not feel realistic due to lack of movement and depth. I developed a solution by manipulating the X, Y, and Z axes at every major movement within the sequence. I then created a smoke effect using Adobe After Effects and a plugin called Starlight. I was then able to create a emitter layer and manipulate an array of different aspects such as particle types, densities, opacities, and shadows. I then added a wiggle sequence to the code to animate the mask and start at one point with full intensity, then fade it out over time. This process was then repeated with the addition of layer masks to give a sense of depth within the scene. Overall, I am very happy with the UFO animational sequence, as I believe it brings together an array of ideas to create a sequence that is short and sweet while still contributing to the flow of production.